Hello YouTube, this is Korean Carlin back with another one. It's a late night and just kind of sitting outside thinking about some stuff, and this topic was on my mind. So basically, we all live in America. Well, not all of us, but most of the people watching this video will be predominantly located in America, the United States of America to be specific. And long story short, there's a couple of things I need to touch up on, but the most important one is, everyone says, America, well, this has been an ongoing saying, but America is the land of opportunities. We preach liberty, equality, fairness, justice for all, and all these things that seem really important, but like when you dig a little bit deeper, you see that they're all just false bottoms or glass houses, for lack of better words. But it's actually a really big issue if you think about it, because long story short, and I'll start with school and then I'll transition to work because it makes more sense to go in chronological order. Actually, I'll start with parenting, and then I'll go to school, and then I'll work my way towards work and what's after that. And I'll stick to these points: fairness, equality, justice, basically freedoms, right, or inalienable rights. So we're given all, well, before I even touch up on that, let's take a step back so I can get some context. So we're in the year 2025 when I'm releasing this video. It's August of 2025 to be specific. And we are using the same system that was founded and enacted by our founding fathers in the 1800s during the 13 colonies when they declared independence against Great Britain and King George, who was a tyrant, right? The whole reason that was done was to avoid another tyranny, right? So I'll ask you a quick question, and let's hope you have some common sense. We have a device in our pocket. 90% of the 8.1 billion people on planet Earth have this, which is stronger than the computer that they used to fly the first spacecraft to the moon, as far as NASA is concerned. Now, that's what we have currently. And we're talking about all sorts of crazy shit like quantum computing and stuff, right? Which is like taking a pile of shit, which would be the iPhone 16 or 17 or whatever. That would be that pile of shit. And then having a whole room of gold bars, right? That's the difference between the iPhone and quantum computing, right? So think about that, right? And all the things that will come from that. Now think about in the 1700s, do you think they were thinking about quantum computing or the iPhone 16? No. They were thinking about the tyrant known as King George, right? In Great Britain, and how to not go back to that in that world, right? We are using that same system, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, all the amendments, etc., right? 90% of those are derived from, if not written word from word, by our founding fathers that were around during the 1800s, right? So is that same system that they put into place still relevant today? Obviously not, right? That's why there's a lot of false bottoms and glass houses, for lack of better words. And what can be done about that is the big issue. That's the premise of this whole conversation that I'll hopefully be having with an audience. But anyways, so something I've learned, along my journey throughout life. I'm 24 right now. I've got gray hair, so I consider myself a little bit wiser than the average 24-year-old, but there's something called mathematical impossibilities. They're problems with no answers. The fact that we have a system that moves like a turtle when it comes to revising things, coming up with new game plans, setting them into action, and things of that nature, means that it automatically creates these mathematical impossibilities. Okay, so there's your context. Now let's move on to parenting. When you grow up, typically you have two parents. Now, you could have abusive parents, you could have average parents, or you could have parents who typically have their nose in the clouds and look down on the world, right? Those are your three types of parents: lower class, middle class, and upper class, right? Now, from the standpoint of a lower class family, and we'll just use abusive because typically they're going through some sort of financial struggle and then they take it out on something, right? Sometimes it's the kid, sometimes it's the wife, sometimes they just go for a bottle or two and then they get angry, right? Anyways, so now the kid is growing up in that environment and they're supposed to have freedoms, especially speech, right? But now they open their mouth, they try to express their opinion, and they automatically get shut down. The parents tell them that they know more than their kid every single time. And their justification as to why is because they're the parent and the kid's the kid. Now, I have personally witnessed a bunch of kids who blow my mind, right? I'm pretty observant, so I'll see kids doing things that kids in my generation weren't doing, but it steps in the right direction. And the fact that they're not getting any credit means that they're getting... I made a video on this previously. It was on a different topic. It was why online gaming is rigged, for lack of better words, but the reinforcers will be all over the place, right? So the kid's sitting here thinking they're doing the right thing, but the parent is scolding them for doing the right thing. So they're getting a negative reinforcer for something positive that they're doing. Now, take a plant, for example, right? Because people and plants share a relationship, right? Through the carbon cycle. What do? Do you scold a plant when it does something right? Do you yell at it? Do you light a fire under its ass because you're pissed off at something else and you just want to take it out on something? It's the quickest way to destroy your plant, right? Is by denying it things, starving it, or just burning it to the ground out of rage. Now, the right thing to do is to give it proper nutrients and everything else it needs, right, in order for it to grow. Now, the same thing is true for a kid. You have a parent, and they either give their kid the right reinforcers or the wrong ones. And in the example I just gave, it's a bunch of negative reinforcers for something positive the kid did. Now the kid gets confused, and usually around that age, because most people seek comfort, it turns into like a drug-related problem, or they'll start acting out in class for attention, so attention seeking, which can turn into drug-related issues. And then there's a huge problem with fentanyl coming from China and stuff, so next thing you know, your kid's dead from a fentanyl overdose, right? That could have been avoided. So that's worst case scenario. The less severe version is they just get into trouble and they end up in jail. Slightly less version is they just don't care. They shut down and then they just act like nothing matters, right? And then they don't become anything, when they could have became like the next president, or they could have invented something that cures like cancer or Alzheimer's or dementia or something, right? And if that happens across the board, it becomes pretty problematic. So it's bad when it's one kid, but it's detrimental when it's a lot of them, all falling short. So now that's lower class. Middle class is your average parent. You know, they have some whatever. But now the kid has to live through that. And because of the Ponzi scheme, pyramid scheme structure, that middle class family looks down on the lower class and looks up to the higher class. Now, there isn't a single perfect being on this planet, right? So what it really makes sense to do is to embrace individuality and uniqueness, right? But instead, everyone is trying to fake it till they make it, and they're trying to copy the guy in front of them, or the girl, whatever, so that they can become that. They basically exalt people, put them on pedestals, which simultaneously means that they're looking down on themselves. So not only are they cheddar bombing themselves or shooting themselves in the foot, right? But they're also taking what they could possibly be doing, throwing it away, and then defaulting and settling for something that's way below their capabilities technically. So that's detrimental, and children look up to parents. So if that's the example that they're setting, then that's what the child's going to do when they become a parent, and it becomes an issue that in that way. And if that's across the board, it's even worse. And if that doesn't happen, then you could obviously expect that the child would shut down, like I said before. That's one option. Or have unrealistic expectations set by the parent, which is like expecting a sapling to be a redwood in like 3 years, right? When it takes a lot longer than that to get there, for example. So that's the unrealistic expectations. And then the parent gets mad at the kid for not reaching those points instead of being understanding, supportive. And most parents at that point are like, we need our kid to be in counseling. They need to see a therapist and a psychiatrist. We need to medicate our kid, right? When do you throw pills into your plant in order to help it grow? You don't. So instead of feeding the kid the right stuff, the right nutrients, and in this case, giving them the right guidance and support, they cut their kid down. They scold them for actually being where they should be in life, right? Because if the parent really thinks back, which they can't do, most parents do not remember past a certain point, whether they want to admit it or not. But if a parent was able to think back on when they were in that kid's exact same spot, they didn't have it figured out either. But yet they became who they are today as an adult, and they're supporting their family. So it goes back to what I was saying about the reinforcers. And then the kid can shut down, can go to drugs, can go to violence. Or the kid, on the contrary, if they get the right, if the right check boxes are checked off, right, the kid could become the next president, or, like I said, do a bunch of extraordinary things. And if that happens across the board, go in one direction, which is positive, or can go in another direction, which is negative. And if the whole world is negative, it's not a pretty world. But if it's all positive, it doesn't sound too bad. Obviously, that's probably not going to happen, but, if it's better than worse, that's not bad. And if it slowly grows in that direction, that's not bad either. Obviously, utopian society is a bit far-fetched, but, taking steps towards it's not. And now upper-class families, right? This is when the expectations get ridiculous. Now, I will say that upper-class families do feed their kids good, nutritious meals, but the upper-class citizens do not know everything themselves. A lot of them rely on other people for advice because they have money that they can use to delegate the responsibilities across the board. So, like, let's say a celebrity, right? They'll have a dietitian, they'll have a fashion designer, and a bunch of other crap, right? Delegating. because they have money to spend, so they can do that. It's like a king having advisors. A good king goes to his advisors for advice, but doesn't depend on them, because a good king can then think for himself, can come to these conclusions, and can use his advisors to bounce ideas off of, right? Not, hey, what do you think? I can't figure this out. Oh, do this. Okay, that's a great idea, despite whether or not it's a great idea, if you see where I'm going with this. There's two ways to live life. You can navigate your own life, and you can learn from experiences and become wise, or you can try to follow other people, like following the leader, the blind leading the blind. And in that world, a funny guy once said to me, in a world full of blind men, One-Eyed Willie is king. So, if you want to put your faith in that, I guess be my guest, but it makes a whole lot more sense to try and be wise, right? And to try and have experience, so you can actually base your opinions on something. Like, for example, in school we learned something called STEM: science, technology, engineering, and math. There's a scientific method which uses deductive reasoning, which backs your claims with facts, so that it's not just an opinion, it's closer to something, closer to objective truth, right? So, long story short, if you can basically make your own decisions, which means that you don't rely on other people as much, then you can help others do the same, and that's wisdom being passed on. If you've ever seen The Giver, that's one example, for example, of wisdom that can be passed on through experiences. So, long story short, you'll have a bunch of parents in the upper class, like I said, who will basically expect their kids to be whatever when then they themselves weren't, and the only thing getting them there is the diet. Now, some upper class families don't even do the diet thing, right? And this is where it gets a little scary. So there are, and I talked about this in my inflation video. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend checking it out. But either way, I'll summarize it and give you a short version. There are a lot of foods out there that give you empty calories. So and some of them don't even give you a lot of calories to begin with. So you'll consume these things, you're expecting something, and you get next to nothing. And then the parents will say, well, you ate your meal, why are you still hungry? You're not allowed to have dessert, or you can't have ice cream after breakfast or after lunch or whatever. Meanwhile, the stuff that they gave them is making them deficient in vitamin D or calcium or whatever, and the kid is craving that, so then he wants ice cream, right? Now, I'm not saying feed your kid ice cream 3 meals a day. That's not the point of this. I'm saying that some things that a parent will give their child is technically missing some of the key ingredients, just like I said, the nutrients for a plant, key ingredients for the kid to grow into a full functioning young adult and then adult. So if you've ever heard of functions in math, there's inputs and outputs, right? So what you put in is what you get out. And we use food and beverages as a form of energy. So anyways, so now you have your rich parent, right, who basically spends all this money to basically stress the kid out with all these high expectations and all these other people talking into the kid's ear, telling them that they should be doing this, that, and the other, but none of the advice is actually valid, right? So now, like I said, it goes back to the reinforcers being all over the place, right? So now, once again, the kid gets confused, and now the kid actually has access to money, so they can actually buy some of these things. I mean, this could lead to the next Sandy Hook shooting, right? The kid buys a firearm and shoots up his school because he's so fed up with the way things are, and then he, probably, fill in the blanks after, because, who wants to face the consequences after that? Or, gang violence and drug-related stuff like I mentioned, but usually an upper-class citizen doesn't get involved in gangs. and they might do drugs. That's not super far-fetched. So that could be one way that they go downhill, or once again they just shut down and they don't become what they could. So either way, it's bad. So that's parenting, and there's more to it, but that's the gist of it. Now we'll go to school, right? And long story short, as far as parenting is concerned, when it comes to freedoms, equality, and fairness, and justice for all, if the kid isn't able to express their opinions without judgment, that's not equality, that's not fairness, that's not being able to express their uniqueness, that's not acceptance. And yeah, there's no freedom there. It's a very controlled environment where the kid is basically told different rules, and some of them make sense, but some of them are kind of unrealistic and don't make any sense. Like, if a kid says something, then the parent automatically interjects and shuts the kid down. That doesn't make sense. And then the alternative is, if the kid says something, now the parent judges the kid, thinks that it's their responsibility to intervene. This goes back to an experiment where it's called like the double slit experiment, where basically particles will act as waves or particles depending on if they're being observed or not. So when a parent tries to do too much, for lack of better words, and stick their nose in everything, be a helicopter parent or whatever, then next thing you know, the kid wants nothing to do with the parent, grows resentment, which didn't have to be there. And instead of them having their parent be their greatest asset, it becomes their greatest obstacle, right? And that's detrimental for the kid and their future. And they say kids are the future because they are. Everyone has a life clock, for lack of better words. We all pass on at some point, and we all have the ability to reproduce, at least most of us, and the ones who don't have options for adoption. So technically the kids are the future. So if they're not set up for success, then the future isn't going to be too bright. And our job as people is to make sure that we pass the puck or the torch along, and we do it in the right ways. So if we're not doing that, then we're not doing our job as people. And there's consequences for everything. Every action has a reaction, for example. And there's domino effects and stuff. So anyways, that's parenting. So now I'll move on to the school system. The school system, even as far as elementary or preschool, right? They sit you down in assigned seats. They give you assignments. When you start your assignment, you're told not to talk. You're told to look down. And if you look up at the night sky, there's no stars out tonight, but because of light pollution, that's another issue. But usually there's stars out, and if you go to certain parts of the world where there's no light pollution, you'll see stars, and you'll see things like basically, I can't remember what they're called, but they're like clusters or whatever, where you see different colors in the sky and stuff, and it inspires people, even adults, but especially kids, because kids have that creative stuff going, the creative juices when they're younger. It's a little bit stronger when you're younger, so it can lead to something if they get inspired. But kids, for example, are told to look down at their desk at a piece of paper that was constructed by an individual that doesn't know everything. So now they're forced to then conform to that system. And private schools are worse because everything's uniform, everything's strict. So there's even less freedom there. But I don't even have to get into that. Most people can fill in the blanks with that. But yeah, so then you're given your assigned seats. You have to sit there every single day. You have to interact with the same people every single day. You have the same teachers every single day. And the teachers teach their subjects in one way, right? It's their unique form of teaching, right? It might be good, it might be bad, but at the same time, it's not embracing individuality, it's not embracing uniqueness. Having to sit in one seat and keep your mouth shut for the majority of class, and then only use your ears, raise your hand when you have a question, be judged by the entire classroom if you look stupid, but it's not a stupid question, it's just everyone judges you in that way, and maybe half the room starts snickering and chuckling, right? It's a negative reinforcer when questions are good. That's how we get to the bottom of things. So now the kid gets scared to answer or to ask questions because everyone's judging, and now the kid shuts down, maybe gets depressed, and a bunch of things can happen from that are negative. So that's one way. And if we embrace uniqueness, individuality, fairness, equality, and freedoms in the school system, it would go the other way. And I mean, there's two ways it can go, good or bad, and they lead to things. I'm sure anyone with common sense can figure out where they lead. So then they're marched to a cafeteria at some point. They sit with typically the same group of people. There's only a limited amount of seats. So most people click up with different people, and then they shun different people who want to sit there with them. And that's considered okay. That's not uniqueness. That's not embracing equality or fairness. You have basically different parties that are separating from each other, and it only gets worse as the years go on. And then you have different physical activities like gym and different things like that, but everyone is matched against everyone. So you'll have, someone who's basically doing like high-level athletic stuff against someone who's basically sitting at home playing video games. And then, the guy who's good at video games is good at other things than the guy who's athletic. Neither of them are terrible people. But when it comes to an athletic sport, one, goes a little bit further in one direction than the other, for lack of better words. And there's no way to, well, there is a way, but they don't choose to section these individuals into different groups so that they can basically become better versions. There's a flow chart, right? There's something called flow state. Basically, you can achieve flow state if your challenge and your potential or what you're capable of doing match. And if they're both at a high level, that's considered flow state. That's what the Buddha calls, is it nirvana? No, it's, anyways, it's basically being present in the moment, for lack of better words. I can't remember the exact word for it, but it's used in a bunch of different ways. And anyways, it typically leads to good things like enlightenment and, different manifestations that are positive, right? Typically growth, for lack of better words. Now, if you think about it for what it is, you could have the kid versing other individuals who are very similar as far as skill level is concerned, and it's very easy to decipher that. You have people who look athletic, or you could have them run the track a couple of times. You can see, okay, these individuals are first through 10th or whatever the first couple of times, and the other guys are below that. So you have the upper guys versing each other and the lower guys versing each other, and eventually some of the lower guys start getting to a point, maybe some of the upper guys start falling behind, you'll switch them out or whatever, and if not, then at some point they can start going head to head. But when the top guy versus the bottom guy, that's when it becomes super problematic. And when you put everyone together, that's exactly what happens, right? So then the bottom guy never grows and the top guy just continues, right? And then the bottom guy usually feels some type of way about this. And there's been a lot of incidents, Sandy Hook and Columbine, and drug-related stuff, fentanyl overdoses and whatnot, gang-related stuff that stem from this. right? So to avoid that, that could be one potential option, for example. Or having someone designated to like literally supervise some of those lower guys in a productive way. And then obviously you got kids who are going to make fun of them, but I mean, there's guidance counselors for that, so that's supposed to help if the guidance counselor doesn't go and force them on the medications, which will slow them down even further, for example. Because if someone's depressed, right, the medications are going to slow down their mind, and then they're going to be even more lethargic on the field. So that wouldn't be beneficial. But if they came up with a game plan, right, like do this, do that, do that. Like, for example, when you go home, run a little before you get on your game, and then get on your game. Or take breaks and then do some exercises in between. And before you know it, you'll start growing in that direction, right? Nothing crazy. You don't have to do like 1,000 pull-ups or anything like that, or walk 100 miles in a day, but like little stuff, right? And then grow from there and push yourself in that direction until you see what you're capable of, right? So that could be one option, right? That would embrace uniqueness, fairness, equality, and all the other things that we like to preach as American citizens and stuff that are unfortunately false bottoms and glass houses. So that's the classroom setting, that's the gym setting, that's lunch setting. Now, after school activities, right? You have some that are basically considered lame, right? Like physics club and all that other stuff. There's a couple gaming clubs, chess club and stuff. And then you have some that are considered more cool, right? Like if you do like football or lacrosse and all that other stuff, right? Soccer. But like for the ones who end up doing one instead of the other, once again, you can give them guidance for how they can continue to grow athletically while they're in those clubs. So it's not just about growing your mind, because if you think about like how your left and right arm work, right? So this is kind of the mind and body relationship. Your right arm is only twice as strong as your left, they say, right? So it makes sense to train your non-dominant side as much as possible. Because if your non-dominant side is, let's put it numerically as a 5, you can only reach a 10 on your dominant side. But if your non-dominant is a 10, you can reach a 20, right? So then it makes sense. So if your mind and body are connected, which we already know they are, because everyone's brain is located inside their skull and their body is attached to their skull through something called the spinal cord. But anyways, so if people basically strengthen their body, they will simultaneously peak harder in their mind, right? And vice versa. So you could have athletes being taught ways to basically expand their mind, because a lot of athletes are considered not the brightest because they don't take school seriously. They don't see the importance of it. They think that their athletic skills are just going to take them to where they need to be. And then you have people who are a little less athletic and more academically oriented, right, or inclined, and they don't take athletics and physical training seriously. So then there becomes these imbalances and discrepancies, and then usually leads to bullying and stuff that could be avoided. Bullying only comes when there's not equality, right? So when both sides think they're right, but neither side get along, that's usually when bullying happens. It's also when wars happen, but that's a different topic for a different discussion. So that's basically most of the stuff that you'll see in school, right? Now let's relate all this back to the Constitution, right? So we've got basically freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of, well, the right to remain silent is another one, and a bunch of other freedoms. different things that we can basically use as road signs, right? So in a classroom setting, like I said, if everyone's forced to then be super uniform, where's the uniqueness or independence there? We have inalienable rights for a reason, right? We're told, well, some of us who I guess were listening, were told that these inalienable rights are there to identify if we're under a tyranny or a oppressive system. We have a zero tolerance policy towards terrorism as a nation, right? But when it comes to the individual, we don't take it as seriously. So basically, oppression and tyranny are next door neighbors to terrorism. It's just when it gets to another level, that's when they call it terrorism. So when you have a bully picking on someone, it makes the victim feel oppressed, right? So then to avoid that, you would try to find some way to create equality, right? And justice for all. But as I just mentioned, the parenting structures, the school system, and even the things outside of school, which I don't really need to touch up on, are pushing in the opposite direction. So then that creates negative reinforcers for something positive. The kids get confused, and like I said, it leads to the same thing every time. It's one of three things: drugs, violence, or suicide. So, long story short, it comes down to the parents, the school, and the system, which is our government. And now let's say we want to change one of these policies, right? We would have to basically either riot or start a union or overwhelm the government with petitions. Now, I don't know about you, but I've tried going up to strangers and I've tried expressing some of my beliefs, and none of them want to hear what I have to say. Everyone is conditioned from a young age to adulthood to just ignore anything that makes them uncomfortable, right? So, yes, some people will go to the gym, but when it comes to a conversation, people would rather look at their phone than hear what someone else has to say about something that's relevant and that actually could impact the future in a positive way. So that's the main issue, is how do you get the word out there to actually make a change? I don't know the answer to that one. Hopefully one of you guys are bright enough to figure that one out, because I can't figure it out. I happen to have been a pretty decent student, but I guess maybe it's my age. I'm only 24, so I can't figure that one out on my own. In addition to that, let's say you want to start a union, right? Well, the unions now are ran by the government. You have to basically host a building, right? You have to purchase it from the state. That's ran by the government. Now you have to recruit people in that building, right? Under the government's nose. So now anything you do is basically being regulated by the government. There is no equality, there's no justice, there's no fairness, there's no independence there. All of it is by their book, right? So you can't really make any change that way either. Now, let's say you want to start putting petitions in. How do you get enough people to do that? You can't. Because in order to do it, you'd have to do what I'm doing, which is making a YouTube video or trying to raise awareness somehow, but you make yourself a target. Like, technically, right now, I'm a target because everything I'm saying is controversial. So not only will I get flack from other people, right, which is bad enough, but I could literally get assassinated like MLK or John F. Kennedy, or even our current president they attempted to assassinate him twice, right? So, lucky for him, he's still alive, but, you know, if you make yourself a target, some people retaliate. And that's the world we live in. It's not what everyone says it is. It's not rainbows and butterflies. It's survival of the fittest, and it's natural selection. The only reason that everyone gets along with each other is because of the whole pyramid and Ponzi scheme thing, where they've recognized that you can have more if you work with the guy next to you than you could if you work alone. So some people will just kind of be a little phony so that they can get more out of it, but it doesn't mean they're actually gonna be there for the person and like give them their arm and leg if they have to, right? That's not how that works with most people. There's basically a saying called "love thy neighbor," right? And a lot of people get it confused. Most people think love is the same as manipulation. So giving but expecting something in return, that's manipulation. And there's some negative connotation that's associated with that. Now, on the other hand, if you give more than you take, and yes, I do recognize that there is a point where the other person will literally just be taking advantage of the person who's giving. Now that's when boundaries come into play, right? You gotta basically say like, hey man, like, you know, I've been given a lot and you haven't returned the favor at all. What's going on? And have a friendly conversation about it, right? And that's fine, right? I have nothing against that. But when people default through conditioning to just give and then expect something in return, that's not love. That's not loving thy neighbor, as I mentioned before. So yeah, those are the main issues, right? And I think it really stems back to the fact that we're using the same system that was put into place by our founding fathers. When we have iPhones and we're talking about quantum computing and digital immortality and metaverses and ChatGPT, open source AI, augmented reality, virtual reality, all that crazy stuff, right? Neuralink, robo-taxis, all that stuff, right? It's being thrown into the mix when we're using the same thing that our founding fathers put into place when they couldn't even fathom a cell phone. They couldn't even think of a regular phone. They had see if I can remember what it's called, but it's basically something that used Morse code. I'm trying to remember what the name of it was because I don't want to blank it. I'm sure one of you guys could figure it out in the comment section below. Yeah, I can't remember what it's called, but they basically sent different signals so that, and they represented something like beeps or whatever, and then each beep represented a word depending on how long it was or the intervals and stuff like that. I think it was called nah, it wasn't that. I don't remember what it's called off the top, but it's not the topic of this video. It's the fact that the system needs to be reformed. And obviously the government's not going to want that, because the government's going to say, okay, that makes us weak as a nation, right? And if we're weak as a nation, vulnerable, then it means that we're probably going to be invaded by foreign nations that want to be the leader of NATO, by seizing America. I mean, America is a great piece of land. I'm a Native American, so technically my people were here before the Europeans sailed to, I believe it was Plymouth Rock, and then set foot onto American soil after westward expansion or whatever, and manifest destiny or whatever they called it back in the day. But yeah, anyways, my people believed in giving and taking in equal amounts. Now I'll talk about a slightly different topic because it just presented itself as I was thinking about it. Homelessness, right? Let's say there was an individual who didn't have a home back when the Native Americans were still, in charge, for lack of better words, or responsible for what was going on in America. A homeless person wouldn't have been called a homeless person. They would have been called a new member of the community. They would have been welcomed with open arms. They would have been given food, shelter, and they would have been taught how to survive. Now, if we go to school, what survival techniques are they teaching us? None. They teach us how to read and write and how to sit still and be silent while someone else is talking, and how to memorize information for a test. Then by the end of the school year, we've forgotten what the information was for the first test. But it doesn't matter because you've already gotten your grade, right? And you'll never use that information ever again, most of the time. I'm 24 years old, and the only concept besides reading and writing and basic math that I've used is the Pythagorean theorem. So basic geometry, right? A squared plus B squared equals C squared. When I was staging my house, before I sold that, I had to basically stage it, right? So I had to basically figure out the hypotenuse of corners so I could find the midpoint of it, so I could basically center some of the objects that I was placing for staging purposes. Outside of that, I haven't used any complex math for anything. And yet,